from a fat loss perspective, what would you say are the top things that people get wrong when conceptualizing and ultimately initiating a fat loss diet?
Most fundamental thing that people get wrong, I would say, is the very concept of what a diet is. Most people these days have the idea that a diet is like a 6-week phase of suffering to get abs for the summer or for your wedding. And afterwards you go back to your normal life. Whereas originally the word diet, it came from Greek, dieta. And that word basically meant lifestyle. So the whole notion of like going on a diet was not the original meaning of the word diet. And I think that's also what a lot of people get wrong when like the average person goes on a diet and you're not doing a bodybuilding show or something. It should not be an unsustainable period of suffering. It should rather be tweaking of your lifestyle to decrease average energy intake, typically, if you want to be on a fat loss diet, perhaps increase energy expenditure, but try to do it in sustainable ways so that you can also keep the fat off. And it's not so important what your rate of fat loss is, but rather that you can maintain it. And if you focus on it that way and also frame it as a lifestyle decision rather than as what is best for fat loss this week, I think people come to very different conclusions and they go about it at a very different way.
What would you say are the most important levers to pull with regards to fat loss?
Diet, 100%. A lot of people especially people that want to give like a get abs quick idea, they overemphasize cardio in particular, and they underestimate the importance of sustainable diet choices and like lifestyle changes in terms of which foods you eat. And it's very difficult to cardio off even a single dessert, like 500 calories. You can easily consume that in a single dessert. It's not even a big one. And it takes more than an hour of cardio often to burn that off, like the above basal energy expenditure. It's just very, very difficult. And that's where all the sayings come from in fitness. They're all cliches because they're true. Like you can't out-train a bad diet. Abs are made in the kitchen. All of that stuff comes down to your diet being the number one thing that determines whether or not you will get lean and, more importantly, stay lean.
That is one of the greatest tragedies in life, just the sheer velocity with which you can consume 500 calories
Yes.
of an ultra-processed, hyper-delicious food, juxtaposed against literally how long it takes to burn that off on a treadmill, for example. So sad.
Yes, that's why it's very important to think of it more as a long-term flux of energy intake and energy expenditure. So like your long-term energy balance, that's what really matters. Basically, if you look at mathematical modeling studies of people's diet and their body composition, what you find is that at any given long-term energy intake, which is essentially the output of your lifestyle, like what kind of food choices do you make? Do you walk every time to the gym? How many times do you go to the gym? Those types of things. It gives you a certain energy balance that you end up in, a certain energy expenditure and a certain energy intake. And that means that over the long term, given all those inputs, you're going to end up at a certain body fat level. Like if your lifestyle would be essentially crash dieting, you eat almost nothing, then you're going to just be contest shape at some point. But for most people, it's more like you're at 2,500 or 3,000 or 2,000 calories. And whether you are at 3,000 calories average or 2,500 calories, that makes a big difference in what body fat level you will gradually gravitate towards. And the lower the average energy intake, the lower the body fat percentage that you'll settle at.
Now, is that a learned behavior or is that genetic, or to what degree is that are those behaviors modifiable?
If you look at research, there is certainly a genetic component, but the nice thing about fat loss is that nothing in fat loss is deterministic. So there are no people who cannot lose fat. They don't exist. There are certain people for whom it's a lot easier. So they might have a low appetite. They might have a fast metabolism. They might enjoy exercise inherently. They might have naturally more willpower. But there are no people who cannot lose fat. There are no people for whom thermodynamics do not apply. Like if you are in an energy deficit, the body has to make up that deficit by burning some of its own tissues. And then especially if you're on a high protein diet, if you do strength training, then that's going to be fat, or it should be. And that's how you lose fat. But the differences are what level of deficit do you have to go to, like what energy intake do you have to go to, how low in calories do you have to go, how difficult is it for you to not succumb to hunger, how difficult is it for you to go to the gym multiple times per week, how difficult is it for you to plan. Those things differ. But given the same inputs, you're going to get the same outputs.
Hmm.
So muscle growth is a lot more determined by your genes. Like some people just have pretty terrible genes. Some people just have amazing genes. Like muscle growth has a much stronger genetic component, but fat loss, not so much. And I think for a lot of people, fat loss is very much a skill. It's something that is very much the result of habit and planning. You can compensate for so many things in your diet with planning. If you plan better, maybe your willpower is not so good, but if you come home, you have a Tupperware container in the fridge that you just have to put in the microwave, you don't need willpower. But if you come home, you haven't prepared food, you're super hungry, and then your wife asks you, hey, do you want pizza tonight? Then it's going to be a lot more difficult, right? So planning takes care of most issues that people have with willpower or hunger or anything.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's very easy for me to dial in my fat loss when I'm eating predominantly home, meals cooked at home. But the minute I have I begin traveling or I start prioritizing more social eating, which typically for me implies eating out, I just end up inevitably going off the rails, because it's just, you're adding in all these variables that are so hard to control. Where am I going to be able to find my food? What are these foods cooked with? Where are the added oils and hidden calories, phantom calories coming from? But when you cook at home, it seems a lot more like you're a lot more able to control the controllables, which I can certainly appreciate.
Definitely. I think social eating is its own skill that is difficult to learn. It's much more difficult than controlling your diet at home. That's usually where it starts. And then when you have your diet at home under control, then things like traveling, social eating, those are skills that most people then have to master. And they are inevitable facts of life. It's not like you have your diet at home and then you would have no control at other times. It's just a different skill. So something that I like, for example, is to always start with a filler. And also very importantly, again, planning, looking at the menu beforehand. Like if you go to a random restaurant, you have no idea what you are getting, then of course you have very limited control. But then you basically already messed up if you want to stick to your diet that meal at least, because you should have had some input in where you're going. And I think that's always reasonable, like whether it's for taste or cost or healthiness, you should always have some input on what you're going to eat. So for a lot of people, looking at the menu beforehand is a great tip, because then you can make a more sane choice without social pressure, without necessarily already being hungry. And then you can decide, for example, okay, so first I'm going to have the veggies, the grilled veggies, for example. They have that at most restaurants. And then maybe your protein. And then after that, if you want more, then you can decide at that moment if you want more. Or maybe you've already decided exactly what you want to eat. But if you at least get your fiber and your protein in, that takes care of a lot of the problems already. And then most people in research also, they end up with a lot lower energy intake, but they are not less happy with the meal. And that's super important to realize, that a lot of people have the idea that the amount of chocolate you put in your mouth is basically like a meter that fills up the happiness. But in reality, it's the satiation of the hunger that brings you the happiness and the joy. So if you can do that on a lower energy intake, people typically end up being just as satisfied with the meal, probably also with some more self-esteem and happier in the sense of controlling your diet. And they don't feel deprived. Because if you have just a little bit of dessert afterwards, after you had your filler and your protein, then you still feel like, oh, I still had my filler. Whereas you can have 10 of the chocolate pieces instead of just one at the end. And then your energy intake is probably also like 10 times that. But you're not really happier with that. Because in both scenarios, you had the chocolate that you wanted and you ended up full. And those are the things that matter.
Is this the concept of satiety?
Yeah, so I like to think of the two S's. What I always teach clients is satisfaction and satiety. So you have satiety, you have to fill your hunger, and you also have satisfaction, because I can tell you, just eat veggies or just eat broccoli. And indeed, if you eat nothing but broccoli, for sure, you're going to lose fat. There's basically nobody that can eat so much broccoli that they're not going to be in massive energy deficit. So you're going to lose fat. And you also don't necessarily need to count calories or any of that. But is it satisfying? No, nobody likes that diet. It's never going to be popular. So that's why both are very important, satisfaction and satiety. And the protein and the filler, they help a lot with the satiety, like filling up your hunger, because you have a certain amount of hunger, which you can think of as like a certain amount of units. Some people have more hunger, some people have less. And you need to fill those up. Now you can fill them up with chocolate, and then every chocolate you eat is just like this much of your like hunger units that you're filling up, or you can eat something like broccoli, and then you can eat a whole lot of broccoli, and it's still only maybe 200 calories, and then you're already like 80% full.
Very interesting. Are there any specific foods or food categories that you would say um, are worth either avoiding or leaning into purposefully to aid with these two variables, satiety and satisfaction?
Mhm. Well, you can't go wrong with veggies and fibrous fruits. So I'm a big proponent of those, fiber in general. But nothing beats veggies and fibrous fruits in terms of the amount of fiber that you get per calorie and the amount of satiety that you get per calorie. Like tomato, for example, or strawberries, you can eat like a pound plus for less than 100 calories. That's just, you can eat so much of it that hunger is never going to be the real problem at that point. So hard to go wrong with those. And then there are a lot of foods that everybody knows that are you should limit. Generally, it's not a good idea to tell yourself you cannot have this. Rather, I tell students or clients you can have this, but it's very caloric. If you want to fit this into your macros, not exceed your calorie budget, then you're probably going to be hungry. Like if you want to eat a whole pizza, maybe you can do that. Maybe you can fit it into your calories, but then you're filling up pretty much all your calories already. And that means the rest of the day you're going to have to be hungry, or you're going to overeat and gain fat. So it's a choice. It's always a choice. But some foods are just very detrimental to fat loss efforts. And typically that correlates with the amount of calories per 100 gram that they have, with all the usual culprits, junk foods, McDonald's, things that are high in carbs, high in fats, ultra-processed foods typically are very unsatiating per calorie. Most people know exactly what they should eat less of. And it's more important, I think, to eat more of the good stuff. Research also finds that because people have less aversion. If I tell you, you have to eat more broccoli, that's like, okay, you can do that. But if I tell you you cannot eat your favorite food anymore, that sucks, right? If I tell you you can eat your favorite food, but first you have to eat a pound of broccoli, that's a lot less. It sounds a lot less bad than just saying you can't eat it anymore.
So no foods are truly off limits, provided you can account for them within your daily or even your weekly calorie budget.
Right.
You just have to be prepared to splurge and then compensate in other ways over the course of over the day or the week.
Exactly. That's where the principle of if it fits your macros comes from, which originated from people asking like, what food should I eat? Should I eat this? Should I eat that? And people said, well, if it fits your macros, you can eat it. So you have a certain calorie budget. And I like to think of it really as a budget because you don't have to be super adamant about it. Sometimes you can overspend, but then you have to realize that that's not sustainable. And you can also under-eat. That's usually fine. You don't have to force feed to make up your 2,500 calories. That's rarely a problem for people, that they end up under-eating so much that they end up crash dieting too fast. That's usually a self-correcting problem. So think of it as a budget, just like with your money. And that also, I think, puts people in the mindset of it's a choice and it's a long-term consideration. Nobody thinks about, am I in my daily money balance? Is it okay? At least you're thinking of it in a monthly basis because of your salary, typically.
Now, you haven't mentioned protein all that much yet over the course of our conversation thus far. And I understand that prioritizing protein is important for many reasons, the satiety benefits, but also for preserving muscle while in a calorie deficit. Because we've all seen the headlines of a nutrition professor here and there who likes to make a point to their students by eating only Twinkies for a month or something like that, to show that ultimately it does come down to energy balance, weight loss specifically. But obviously, when initiating a weight loss plan, I think most people would prefer to actually specifically lose fat mass as opposed to lean mass. So what role would you say protein plays in this?
Protein plays a very large role. It helps in almost every direction. Protein is very satiating, at least up until your requirements. It seems that protein is more satiating than carbs and fat, or rather your body keeps your appetite high until it has had enough protein. It's called protein leverage. Because protein is very important and it's very difficult to store for the body. The word protein actually comes from proteos, meaning of first importance. That's literally how important it is.
Wow.
So it's already in the name. And it also helps, it doesn't just help with satiety. It also helps a little bit with energy expenditure because protein has a higher thermic effect of food than the other macronutrients. Again, at least up until requirements, because then it increases protein synthesis, which increases energy expenditure. Like muscle growth helps in two ways with fat loss. One is that muscle growth is an energy-intensive process, meaning that if you are building a lot of muscle mass, then your metabolism goes up. It takes a lot of energy to build that. It's like building a house. You cannot just put the things there. The construction process itself is very demanding. So it helps in that sense. But what a lot of people don't realize is that muscle growth also helps in muscle preservation, because when you create an energy deficit and the body has to make up that deficit by burning some of its own tissues, that's a zero-sum game, meaning if you burn muscle, that's fat that you're not losing because the body got the energy from the muscle. And even better is if you're building muscle and you increase energy expenditure, and then the body has to essentially burn more fat to fuel that muscle growth process.
Yeah, I've always, when initiating a fat loss phase, I try to dial in my protein target first, and then fill in the gaps in terms of my caloric needs with carbohydrates and fats, typically. So how much protein would you say one needs to set as a target? And does it differ whether in a fat loss phase or say a muscle building, a bulking phase?
So based on the current research, it seems that about 1.2 gram per kilogram per day is sufficient to optimize satiety and most health benefits for someone that doesn't do strength training, or in general doesn't do like rigorous exercise. Now you should do rigorous exercise and you should do strength training, which means your requirements go up to at least 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. So that's about 0.7 gram per pound in freedom units. And if you really want to make sure that you're maximizing muscle growth, especially in something like energy deficits, more higher training volumes, then I recommend 1.8 gram per day, which is 0.82 gram per pound per day. That's total protein intake based on total body weight. But it assumes that you get that protein in, say, at least 3 meals, with at least 50% of your protein intake coming from high quality sources. Now, are protein requirements higher in energy deficit? Most of the research does not actually support that. It's a very popular theory. Funny enough, just last week, the first study was published which actually found some direct support for the idea that energy deficit does increase protein requirements, but it only looked at it on a single meal basis. There are multiple studies that find that 1.8 gram per kilogram per day is still sufficient in weightlifters, in energy deficit, in military personnel. There are a couple studies that show it's still enough. So maybe there is a small increase, but most of the evidence at this point does not actually support that.
And how should one's protein intake be distributed throughout the day? Is there value to keeping it evenly distributed? Or I know there are some, I don't understand them, but there are people who prefer to consume one meal a day. Is there any downside to that? Yeah, what are best practices in terms of protein distribution?
If you want to really maximize muscle growth, I would probably recommend 4 meals a day minimum. I think you're going to also be able to maximize muscle growth with 3 meals per day. Below that, it gets difficult. And it's also important that every meal has at least a decent amount of protein. There are a couple studies, the evidence isn't crystal clear, but there are a couple studies which find, for example, that if you have 2 meals and then you have a small meal with only 5 or 10 grams of protein, you don't get the same muscle growth or the same protein synthesis or the same nitrogen balance, all measures of the same essentially, as you get if you have that protein intake in at least 3 meals distributed across the day. Because there is something called the muscle full effect, which basically means that on a per meal basis, you cannot just eat more and keep increasing your protein synthesis. Certain things increase the ceiling of protein synthesis, like doing a workout, fasting beforehand. But it certainly currently seems unlikely that just 1 or 2 meals per day can maximize muscle protein synthesis throughout the entire day.
Is there any limit to how much protein the body can utilize in one meal? Sometimes you see this myth, or I don't know if it's a myth. I'm sure you can speak to it. This concept circulating on social media that the body can only use 25 grams of protein per meal.
Yeah, there is a limit to how much protein the body will acutely use for muscle protein synthesis. And multiple studies show that if you eat more than that, the body will usually oxidize the protein. However, recently there was a study which showed that that limit might be as high as 100 grams. If that is pretty much your entire protein intake for the day, you just had a workout and you were fasting before that, right? So the limit is adaptable, and usually the body tries to regulate protein synthesis to accommodate your current schedule, but it is limited in that sense. Yeah, so there's a limit, but it's adaptable. And some people say, well, based on the research, maybe there is no limit at all. But I think we can pretty much rule that out de facto, because what if you had one meal per month? Like, I don't think there's anybody that believes you can maximize muscle growth for like a month with one meal. You know, you just go to a steakhouse and pig out, and then you can fast the rest of the month. It doesn't work. So clearly there must be some limit, and based on the research, that seems to be about 3 meals per day if you want to maximize muscle growth. It doesn't mean you cannot have a successful diet with 2 meals a day. It just means that probably muscle growth will not be maximized, especially when you're bulking, you know, like bodybuilding type program where you're really trying to do high volume training and squeeze out every little bit of muscle growth that you can. Then I would recommend 3, maybe even 4 meals per day minimum.
Well, I would assume that if you're eating a big mixed meal with fats and carbohydrates, and, you know, the meal has 50, 60, 70 grams of protein, say it's like your dinner, right? And that dinner is going to take hours to digest. Would you say is it a fair assumption that you know that protein is not going unwasted?
Probably not, no. And there is some research suggesting that, like studies by Kim et al., they find that up to 80 grams seems to still be pretty much used for either protein synthesis or to reduce protein breakdown. So, you know, a case can be made that if you time it really well, you can do it in 2 meals. If you do it in 2 meals, I think you have to time it really well with your workout, because there's also quite some research on the importance of like having meals around the workout and not training fasted. Ideally, you probably don't want to train fasted. I actually have a study on this that we just did, and we're going to publish that, which also supports this. Can't go into the full details yet, but it shows that we don't want to train fasted, basically, for maximum gains at least. So if you have only 2 meals per day, then at least one of those has to be, you know, somewhat close to the workout, and then the other one has to be somewhat close to after the workout. Typically, I recommend 5-6 hours between the pre and the post-workout meal. That's pretty much the maximum that you want to let pass, again, for like maximum body recomposition. So if you have 2 meals per day, that limits your options a lot. And 3 meals a day makes it just a lot easier, and means that, you know, the exact balance of is it enough protein in this meal and that meal becomes a lot less important. And then with 4 meals a day, it probably doesn't matter that much anymore.
One of my favorite blog posts of yours is about the concept of simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. Is it possible to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of research that shows it is possible. Now, it gets more difficult as you get more muscular. Like, the more muscular you are, the more difficult it gets to continue building muscle in general, but especially energy deficit. There was a really good meta-analysis that showed that you can essentially plot the decrease in muscle growth that you get based on the energy deficit. And especially beyond a deficit of about 500 calories, they found that it became very difficult to continue building muscle. But if your deficit's not too large, you're not super advanced, then you can still build muscle in energy deficit. And physiologically, that's also extremely, there's no reason why that wouldn't be possible. If you think of it, for example, if you couldn't build lean tissue mass when you were in energy deficit, what would happen when you had a surgery in the hospital and they didn't give you enough food? Like, you had open heart surgery, for example. Like, your heart literally wouldn't recover, because your heart would be like, no, sorry, I'm in energy deficit. Clearly, that doesn't work. And it's because every single tissue in the body, whether it's the heart, the muscle group, the biceps, the quads, they are all regulated independently. So you can have positive energy balance or nitrogen balance or protein balance in one tissue and have it negative in the other tissue. In fact, while we're speaking, at any tissue in our body, there is a certain state of energy balance and protein balance, and they are somewhat independent of each other. So there was also a recent study, for example, that found that if you only train certain body parts, then those will grow, and then other body parts that you don't train will lose size, which is pretty obvious, but it illustrates the point that every tissue is regulated independently.
Wow, very interesting. And I mean, I don't know how close or far I am from my genetic potential in terms of muscle growth. But what would you say are the levers that might help encourage muscle growth while in a calorie deficit? You mentioned already, making sure that your calorie deficit is relatively slight, but is there anything else that might help tilt the scale in favor of muscle growth while in that calorie deficit?
Mhm. I have a calculator actually on my website, which gives you the best evidence-based guess you have as to what your maximum muscular potential is. But anything that makes it easier to build muscle, anything that helps with muscle growth in general, will also help with muscle growth in energy deficit. And that is pretty much everything. So the basics are strength training, doing in particular your strength training volume, like up to a point, more is better. And your protein intake, you need to get enough protein. Then the size of the energy deficit is very important. If you go beyond a certain energy deficit, it becomes very, very difficult. So typically, relatively slow cutting, especially if you're already lean, is better for body recomposition than trying to crash diet your way to a six-pack. That doesn't work. You're going to lose muscle mass, or at best, you're going to just maintain muscle mass, whereas you could maybe be recomping still, which is going to give you a lot better long-term outcome. Because fat loss is, compared to muscle growth, fat loss is relatively easy. Like you can lose quite some fat in a month, but no matter what you do, it's going to be very difficult to build more than, say, 1 kilo, 2 pounds of muscle in a month. Like even for a beginner, more than that is very difficult without anabolic steroids, that is.
How does one know how close or far they are from their genetic potential? It's super interesting that you have a calculator on your website. I haven't seen it, but is there anything you could share?
Basically, it looks at your level of muscle mass currently. You need some estimate of your body fat level, and typically it's better when you're leaner. And then it compares it to the fat-free mass. It uses a calculation for your fat-free mass index, which is like BMI, but for muscle mass. And it compares that to natural bodybuilders that we pretty much knew for sure were natural. And we have a sample size of that, and then it corrects for like the measurement error. And you can basically say, okay, so this is based on your stats, based on your wrist circumference, your ankle circumference, which is kind of like the real estate that your body has. Like the bigger your joints, the bigger your frame size, the more muscle you can build around it. It's like a coat rack. Like if you have very big hangers, you can hang more clothes around it. So you have that kind of as the baseline, and then we know, well, this is pretty much the upper limit. So we can get like an estimate of percentage-wise where you are. Now it's always going to be an estimate. We can't divine exactly for you what the number is going to be, but we can make an educated guess.
Wow, super. I have to check that out. What would you say are the role of carbohydrates in muscle building? Because I see, studies that, sometimes I feel like I have whiplash from the studies that suggest that, keto, for example, is not ideal when it comes to hypertrophy or building strength. But then I believe it was you that posted, it was either a study or a meta-analysis, I don't remember, that found that keto doesn't affect strength gains in any significant way. And then, it's not ideal, as you mentioned earlier, it's not ideal to train fasted, but also there was something that you posted that seemed to have suggested that carbohydrates before a workout don't actually improve exercise performance. So what's your read, on that literature?
It was taken as gospel for a long time in the bodybuilding community that you need to be on a high carb diet for strength training. And in terms of the evidence-based fitness, that idea came back all the way to endurance training. So we have a lot more research on endurance training than we had on strength training. Like evidence-based strength training, bodybuilding, powerlifting, all that stuff is basically only a thing since the 90s. And since then, we've had a lot more research. But it has taken a long time before the idea, or almost the presumption, that we need carbs for strength training, just like we need them for, say, soccer or tennis, has been dispelled. And I was part of the first systematic literature review. Literally, there had not been a single systematic literature review up until that point, where we actually looked at all of the evidence, all of the studies, classified it into acute studies, long-term studies, medium-term studies, studies with glycogen depletion. And we found that in the vast majority of cases, your long-term results, strength development, and even muscle growth are not affected by your carbohydrate intake, because a strength training workout just doesn't burn the same amount of glycogen as, say, a soccer match. Like there's evidence that high-level soccer players will burn up to 90% of their glycogen stores in a single match. And you get maybe 40%. The highest reported value in the literature, based on a lot of evidence, including bodybuilders, is 39% of glycogen depletion from a strength training workout. And then, unlike endurance training, typically you don't train that muscle group again, at least not with a high volume the next day. So worst case scenario is like 24-hour recovery period. And there are multiple mechanisms by which the body can resynthesize glycogen, even with very scant carbohydrate availability. So the Cori cycle, basically carbohydrate can be somewhat recycled. If really needed, it can use amino acids, gluconeogenesis. You don't want that though, because you want your protein to go towards muscle growth. And then it can also use the glycerol backbone of triglycerides, so fats. Fats can actually be used to create carbs, to create glucose. Now, the body typically doesn't do that unless you are in, say, a ketogenic diet. So the body is, in this sense, very accommodating to low carb intakes for strength training. Like, it's a different game, no pun intended, for soccer or tennis. But strength training, you just don't need that much carbohydrate. And we currently have 2 more studies about this, more specifically related to muscle growth. But for strength development, the evidence is quite clear, I would say, at this point.
It's super interesting because for a long time, I really enjoyed fasted workouts, and I would feel very strong, and I would feel gaslit by people who would suggest that you need carbohydrates pre-workout to really optimize your resistance training sessions. But then I took up boxing during the pandemic, which is an endurance sport. It's like, I would presume similar to, I've never played soccer, and I would feel that without carbohydrates in my system, I would not last. I would just hit a wall. And to me, that was the first time in my life that I really saw the energy boosting power of carbohydrates. And then since that experience about 4 years ago, taking boxing for about a year and a half, I've been eating like carbohydrates in my pre-workout setting as my pre-workout meal. And it's just interesting because I suppose I haven't seen that much of a strength benefit from doing that pre-resistance training, but I definitely saw a big boost doing that pre-boxing. Very interesting.
That's 100% in line with the research, because it's just a completely different level of energy expenditure. And you also feel it, like boxing is a whole lot more intensive for the cardiovascular, for the respiratory system. Like the total energy expenditure from boxing is through the roof compared to strength training. In particular, because with boxing, you're basically non-stop exercising. And with strength training, very often, it's like 30 seconds of exercise, 3 minutes of rest. So the work to rest ratio is completely different.
So there's no necessity, would you say, for strength gain and even fat loss? There's really no necessity to. Carbohydrates do play an anti-catabolic role, though, do they not?
They have an anti-catabolic role that is mostly mediated by insulin. The thing is that if you consume enough protein, then that will stimulate enough insulin already, because protein is also insulinogenic. And research finds that if you already consume enough protein, then carbohydrates have no further additive effect on that for reducing protein breakdown. Carbohydrates only have a positive effect when you compare it to fasted workouts, for example. And also that's what most of the studies that find carbs improve performance, they compare carbs to nothing. So somebody having absolutely nothing versus somebody consuming some carbs. And then there is some evidence, still the majority of evidence does not find benefits, but there is some evidence that you're better off consuming some carbs. And that's why I typically recommend you take at least 15 gram net carbohydrates, so not including fiber, before a workout, and enough protein, like 0.3 gram per kilogram, say 20 gram high quality protein, 15 gram carbs. That's a snack, that's not a big meal. And that pretty much you're covered. If you have to do like more than 10 sets per muscle group per session, or you're doing like a crazy high volume, something like that, or maybe mixed endurance and strength training, we're talking about maybe different numbers. But for the average individual doing a gym workout, 15 gram carbs is a good safety measure. And even when you train fasted, as you say, it's not going to be a big difference. Like, I think it's not optimal to train fasted for muscle growth nor for strength development, but it's really not a very big difference.
Very interesting. So when calculating your macro targets for diet, for a fat loss diet, would you set your protein target first, and then would you, seeing as carbohydrates don't seem to be that essential to the process, would you then look to your fat intake to optimize? Because there was another great post. I keep referencing your post because I just get so much value from your Instagram. that I believe it was 40%. You want your 40% of your calories to come from fat to optimize hormones like testosterone. So would you then go from your protein to setting your fat intake target?
If you have the calories, ideally, yes. But I would note that while it is optimal to get at least 40% of energy intake from fats, or maybe it's a certain amount of per body weight, but we don't have that much research on it. So let's say 40% of energy intake from fat. That is ideal to maximize your testosterone levels. But it's a very small difference. So what you're going to get from that is maybe like a pound from that amount of testosterone. And that's not a big number. Maybe it affects your long-term netty max more, but that's completely speculative. So it's a very small effect. And it basically means that, well, for both carbs and for fats, it's a very small effect. And it just doesn't matter that much what you fill up the calories with. But yeah, if someone tells me I want to maximize muscle growth, they're bulking, have a lot of calories, I would say go with 40% fat and then fill in the remainder with carbs. You're going to have enough carbs and enough fat and enough protein.
So ultimately it comes down to personal preference, and you can kind of split hairs by, optimizing your fat to a certain target, but it ultimately, whatever's going to make the diet most sustainable for you is probably the macro proportion ratio that you should stick with.
Yes, but I would caveat personal preference with the finding that allowing people to self-select their diets according to their personal preference has actually been found in most research to reduce diet sustainability. So yes, personal preference matters, but allowing people to self-select the diet they want the most does not actually typically improve diet adherence. So I go into this in my book, and there are a couple explanations for it. People select diets that they want, not necessarily what they need. So people that like carbs typically will select higher carb diets, but those might be the foods that you have to work on reducing rather than allowing yourself to keep those in. Because you can keep in bread and grains and starches and the like, but a lot of people benefit a lot from reducing those foods because they're very energetic, like they're very calorically dense. So those might be exactly the foods that you benefit from reducing your intake of. There's also some research in other settings, like if you get a new diet, or especially if you get it from a coach, you might have more faith in it than if you select it yourself. And there's also an argument to be made that people sometimes learn more when they do something that they are not used to, so that they have to make changes. Because what I found as a coach is that if the worst type of client you can get is someone who tells you, I want different results, but I don't want to change anything I'm doing. Right? That's impossible. You cannot work with that. Like you keep doing the same things, you're going to keep getting the same results. So I think for these reasons, it's not necessarily the case that if you like carbs, then you should be on a high carb diet. Or if you like fats, you should be on a keto diet. So that's interesting. But I think if you have actually tried both, then you can make a much more informed decision. And I think for a lot of people in fitness right now, there's a big divide. Like it's almost like a religion where you're high carb or you're low fat or you're keto or you're vegan. And then people feel like they've never even tried anything else. And they also think anyone else is evil. It's not just like you have a different diet. No, it's like you are the devil. If you eat meat, you must be a Republican and you are the enemy, right? This now it's all become connected with politics and
tribalism.
Yes, very tribal.
Yeah, it's really bad. There was a post you posted recently about a study that was testing a new algorithm to see whether or not red meat was associated with any of the negative health outcomes that it's been long thought to be associated with, right? And this study, although I guess in the introduction, in the abstract, it wasn't, the intent of the study was not to come to conclusive answers about the health effects of red meat. Nonetheless, it did. And but you teased out, I think, the more relevant and practical take home from the study. And I think there was some controversy around that post, right, regarding whether or not red meat is the dietary boogeyman that it's often made out to be. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, any of my posts about red meat are always become very controversial. In fairness, it was a pretty weak study. I think almost all epidemiological studies are quite weak. And the study was not designed to actually test that effect, but they used a new method that is statistically very sound, and they found that the method is valid. So that means that the actual analysis that they're doing is also valid. Now, I also related it back to actual randomized controlled trials, which are far more important and far better, and other systematic data. Like they pulled a lot of their data from a systematic review. So the conclusions of that systematic review are a lot more important for our knowledge and for scientific research than the new analysis. So some of that criticism was definitely deserved. Should have highlighted the limitations more of that study. But I think the conclusions are perfectly sound, and they align with a lot of the other research that we have, that red meat is not healthy, but it's also not unhealthy. And a lot of people cannot grasp that. Same with eggs, for example. So eggs and meat are super nutritious, great protein sources, great for fat loss. They're relatively lean, especially if you have the lean meat. So excellent protein source, full of nutrients, iron, zinc, full of micros. But if you consume more red meat in a study, you typically do not see that someone's HDL goes up, their blood pressure goes down, like their blood sugar, or the blood sugar goes down, blood pressure goes down. If you do that with, say, avocado or vegetables, you do see that, or with olives, right? You make somebody consume more avocado or more olives, you can actually see acutely that their biomarkers improve. And we also have the epidemiological research correlating those intakes with long-term health improvements and longer lifespan, better longevity, lower all-cause mortality. So there we have very strong evidence, like olives, avocado, vegetables. Those are very healthy foods. Nuts, also pretty good track record. With meat, it's more neutral. So meat's not unhealthy. It's not like typical mainstream media would have you believe if you consume meat, it's going to clog up your arteries, you're going to die next week. But meat's also not itself going to make you healthier. So meat is more something that you consume for the nutrients, and then you need other foods like added veggies to make it healthy. So I would classify meat in terms of health effects mostly as neutral, which typically is a conclusion that if you do that in fitness, you piss everybody off because you have the keto, the carnivores and everything. And they're like, oh, he said it's not healthy. And then you have the vegans and he's like, he said it's not unhealthy. So, and I think it's more a middle of the road approach where we have basically, there are a lot of proponents of meat and there are a lot of people that are vehemently against meat. And I think the truth is simply kind of in the middle for that. And there's a big difference between nutritional value and that in itself can have health effects, right? If it helps you diet, if it helps you get your protein in, if it's satiating, if it helps you lose fat, then the fat loss will make you healthier. But if you just tell people like eat more meat no matter what, and you're going to be healthier, that's probably not going to happen.
But isn't lean red meat? I mean, just to push back a little bit, and I do think that this is the right approach. That that the truth is always somewhere in between the polar extremes. But red meat is, and we'll even take lean red meat as an example for the sake of the argument. It's so satiating because it's so high in protein that it's almost as difficult to overeat, I would say, as whole fruit, in that it's self-limiting, right? Whole fruit is loaded with fiber and water. And avocados, avocados are very calorie dense. You could hypothetically eat enough avocados to become obese, were that your prerogative. I don't think anybody out there is obese due to their avocado consumption, but like hypothetically you could, which would then cause dysregulation to all of the biomarkers that you referenced.
Yes. So that's even more the case with nuts or olive oil, for example, where we have very solid evidence that those are very healthy. They have a lot of compounds, phytochemicals, good fatty acids that are health improving. They improve health biomarkers, reduce inflammation. Meat doesn't have those types of compounds, but it is in practical sense a very good food, almost tempted to say healthy, because it will help with fat loss and it will help you have a good diet. And if you avoid meat completely, like vegans, then you often run into problems with B vitamins, iron, zinc. So I think meat can absolutely, and probably should be for most people, be a part of an optimized healthy diet. Although you can get a lot of those nutrients from like shellfish and the like too, if you want to go that route. But yeah, like I said, the compounds in itself, we have to differentiate that from its fat loss effects or muscle growth effects, right? Those are different factors. So health is just health and fat loss. Fat loss will make you healthier, but they are separate considerations. Something can make you healthy just inherently because of the compounds it has, or something can indirectly, potentially make you healthier because it helps you lose fat and it helps you have a satiating and nutritious diet.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would say that generally a food like peanuts are healthy. They're legumes, right? But if you feed 100 people peanuts, one of those people statistically is going to die, But that doesn't
Right.
make it not a healthy food. I mean, everybody's
Exactly.
different,
Yeah.
and you have to take we do have to take a more nuanced approach. Tell me about alcohol. Does alcohol impair fat loss?
Alcohol does not directly impair fat loss, but it is super caloric. And alcohol is a macronutrient, unbeknownst to many people. It is the only macronutrient that, on balance, does not reduce your energy intake. It doesn't satiate you, it makes you hungrier. So that's terrible, right? It's even worse than the foods we talked about earlier in terms of desserts and things that are easy to overeat on. Peanuts, also, yes, very easy to overeat on. Olive oil, healthy but easy to overeat on. And then you have junk foods, which are easy to overeat on and not healthy. So the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Alcohol, right?
Alcohol for fat loss. Yeah.
Yeah. So alcohol is the worst of both of those worlds, where it's super caloric and it increases your hunger, which means that, and also it decreases self-control. So that is the worst possible combination you can have for your diet, pretty much, where after a night out, you come home, you're hungry, you have low self-control, and you already had a lot of calories. And yeah, what choices are you going to make at that point? Or if you're still in town or whatever, you're going to often make bad choices. So it's just, in theory, if you fit it into your macros, alcohol is not inherently fattening. Although some research does suggest it has very poor effects on nutrient partitioning. It can decrease protein synthesis. It can decrease your testosterone levels. So, it's probably not entirely neutral and entirely explainable by the calories. But by and large, I know a lot of people that drink alcohol. Sometimes they fit it into their macros. They still lose fat. But in practical terms, for a lot of people, very, very difficult.
Yeah, I don't think people realize that alcohol is almost as caloric on a gram for gram basis as pure oil. As
Yes.
oil, you're essentially, I mean, not quite, but you're pretty close to drinking oil when you consume alcohol. 7 calories per gram is 2 calories away from pure fat,
Yep.
which is
I mean,
9
it's like
calories per gram.
150 calories for many consumptions. And then you're not even talking about cocktails, which really go through the roof.
Yeah, once you start adding in the sugar, the sugary mixers, and the like, yeah, it's a huge problem. Does alcohol impact muscle growth? Like, I have in my head, this could be just like orthorexic Max talking, but like if I've had a great workout, um, during the day, I particularly will avoid alcohol. I'm not a big drinker, but I generally won't drink. Like, I'll be particularly alcohol avoidant on the night following a good workout, because in my head, it's like I'm adding I just want to like optimize recovery for that workout. But is there any actual like science there? Does alcohol actually impede um, muscle growth independent of the effects that it might have on sleep, for example?
There's quite some research, mostly on recovery and protein synthesis. And there's only one study on alcohol and actual muscle growth. And that study did not find an effect of moderate consumption on muscle growth. If you look at the studies on recovery and protein synthesis, it makes sense because you need quite large amounts to actually start reducing protein synthesis and impede recovery. So if you have, a drink here and there, pretty trivial impact if you fit that into your macros. But if you do a workout, you don't have protein, and you go out binge drinking, that's definitely going to impede your gains. So I would say alcohol is more benign for your gains, like muscle growth and strength development, than you would think, based on how destructive it is in terms of how it can make you feel and like how wasted you can get. So it's kind of less toxic for the muscles than for the rest of your body, but it's definitely a negative, and it's very much the dose makes the poison. So moderate consumption, probably not much of a problem. Heavy consumption, bigger problem.
What about everybody's other favorite topic, caffeine? There's this notion that has been perpetuated, I guess, by some on social media, that coffee in the morning is not ideal, that we should be delaying our morning caffeine intake. Is there any truth to that?
It's funny because that's an entirely theoretical belief, because based on the adenosine receptors. But if you look at the science behind that, it would be maybe that in the first hour it's less effective, but research doesn't support that at all. Like, there's no empirical research actually finding worse effects. In fact, based on pre-workout supplementation, the effect on your workout, which might differ from productivity or whatever, it's more effective in the mornings. Research is quite clear on that. We have multiple studies showing that caffeine in the mornings is more effective than caffeine in the evenings because the caffeine offsets the negative circadian rhythm effect of doing a workout in the mornings. So especially your core body temperature is higher in the afternoons. It's also why, for example, most world records are broken in the afternoons to early evenings, because every small little difference has a big effect on when you're competing at that level. And caffeine essentially undoes that to a degree. So you get that benefit in the morning, but you don't get that benefit in the afternoon. And in the afternoons, most research finds that caffeine doesn't really improve your long-term results. Caffeine's benefits are mostly psychological. So funny enough, there's some research, for example, that people that are told they are consuming caffeine, they get more of a performance boosting effect than people that are told they are consuming a placebo, but it's actually caffeine.
Wow.
Right. So yeah, it's very, very mental. And if you think about it, it just makes you feel more energized and it makes you ready to train. Even that's probably partly a placebo, because there's research, for example, that an energy drink is no more stimulating than pure caffeine. Some research even indicates that pure anhydrous caffeine, just the powder or a pill, is more performance enhancing than that in coffee. So a Red Bull, for some people though, has more mental effect. And that's probably just the association of Red Bull with extreme sports. They have great marketing. You have the popping sound when you open the can and the sparkle and everything. But independent research has specifically looked at Red Bull and found that it doesn't actually do anything other than the caffeine. Like caffeine is the only active ingredient in there. But people might get a stronger placebo effect from the fact that they're consuming an energy drink, right? Energy drink, surely it must give me energy. And therefore you might get, in practice, a stronger mental effect.
Wow. So just to tie a knot on the caffeine in the morning conversation, caffeine, at least in terms of exercise performance, caffeine in the morning seems to be more effective than caffeine later in the day.
Yes. And there's also no research indicating that caffeine is less effective for mental effects or anything in the mornings. I mean, I just ask people, like, what do you feel for your morning coffee? A lot of people feel their morning coffee very well. A lot of people can barely wake up without it. So do you feel your morning coffee a lot less than your afternoon coffee? For most people, I would not say that that's the experience at all.
I don't drink coffee to wake up. I wake up to drink coffee. That's
Nice.
I saw somebody post that on X, and I thought it was very, very, very relatable. Tell me a bit about your background, because I know that you're actually, we had Dr. Mike Israetel on the show recently, and he mentioned that you were in the process of getting a PhD.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'm one of the very few people that became a researcher without getting his PhD. And I'm now working together with a university in Spain to do research. And if we get a certain number of increased publications and I have to get hours and stuff, then I will get my PhD from that, which is nice. It's more like a personal achievement thing, because I'm already
So cool.
A publishing scientist. Like most people, you do their PhD to learn how to publish science. But in my case, I just want to do the research. And if I can also get my PhD with that in the process, that's awesome. So that's going to be great. I'm working with Miquel Izquierdo, who is a awesome researcher. His citation indices and any of those academic standards are absolutely through the roof. So that's great. And also great opportunity to work with him and learn more, continue improving my research skills. But my original background is actually in behavioral psychology. So it's basically a combination of psychology and economics, and I minored in statistics. And I was very fortunate to go to very good universities where they emphasized science and statistics a lot. So that's where I learned those skills, and I published my bachelor's thesis. And then when I got into fitness, I kept publishing research, kept working with other researchers and labs. And yeah, I love that. I'm a super big proponent of science. So I want to keep doing that. I don't get paid for it, but that's just something that is close to my heart and I'm passionate about. So I like to keep doing that while I have my own business to run.
And you're coaching, and were you, correct me if I'm wrong, but were you also not a competitive bodybuilder?
Yes, I've also competed. Probably not going to do that anymore, because it just takes so much out of your, everything, but also your career, family, everything. It's very, very draining. And currently it's just hard to rationalize, keep doing that. Also for me, the bodybuilding aspect, I was a model also, I did photo shoots. and that's more my personality. Like I like creating art, if you will, and the bodybuilding, posing on stage and everything. I like it in some sense, but it's not like I'm dying to be there on stage and in my posing trunks and flex for the crowd. That's I don't have that. So, but it made me a better coach. And now I still do some coaching, but mainly I do education. So my main business is a PT certification program, personal training certification. And also now I have a personal development course where I kind of go back to my roots of psychology and economics and also teach people, I think, the basic skills that should have been taught at schools about your major life decisions. Like how do you choose your partner? How do you invest money? For Americans, like investing money is more into the culture, but in Europe, many people, they have no idea. They think investing is like going to a casino, and it's completely different. So they have no concept at all of that, and very poor education. So I think there are a lot of these kind of life skills where we have a lot of research on, like children, should you rent or should you buy? Mostly related to psychology and economics that I've kind of tied in more as a bonus because most of the course is still fitness. But I feel like I've learned things about it in my personal life, and I've looked at enough of the research that I can provide value to people there too.
That's super interesting. And you're in Spain currently. Do Spaniards still implement the siesta, the daily siesta? Is that still a thing?
Yeah, a lot of people don't sleep, but the stores close and the like. So they have like long breaks. For example, funny enough, Spain is one of the few places where the gym gets super crowded at 2, because that's like the siesta time, and then people have like 1 or 2 hour off work, and a lot of people go to the gym. Like I said, people don't usually sleep anymore, but that was originally the actual the idea. In part also because it just becomes too hot. Like the afternoons are unbearable in the summer in particular. And now it's all right, but if you're here in July or August, which I'm never, then it's bad. But actually, I live myself in Portugal, but my girlfriend lives in Spain, so I spend a lot of time here, and that's also why now I do the PhD here too. So now I have the PhD and the girlfriend here, so I spend quite some time in Spain.
Wow. Are you in Lisbon?
I'm in Albufeira.
I've never been to Spain, but I've been to Portugal. I've been to Lisbon, and I love it there. One of my
Also
favorite,
awesome.
yeah, one of my favorite dishes is bacalhau, which
Hmm.
is, I guess, the national dish. There's
Yeah.
actually in my cookbook, Genius Kitchen, I have a sort of a take on the traditional bacalhau with sweet potatoes and cod, and it's like so delicious. One of my favorite dishes. Super healthy.
Yeah, they
Well,
have mastered the art of getting any flavor out of that fish, because if you make it yourself, it's very difficult to make it taste like anything other than just salt.
it doesn't taste like anything. Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, so cool. I feel like yeah, there we could probably go on endlessly, but we're on vastly different in vastly different time zones, and I want to be respectful for your time and leave room for a round two. But I thought this was a great sort of introductory course to calibrating and implementing a fat loss diet, which I know is you know, certainly of interest to a lot of my listeners, but also at the, for the public at large, a public, at least here in the United States, that struggles with overweight and obesity. We have about 40% of our population here, not just overweight, but obese. And we're
Mhm.
trending for about 50%. Half the population by the year 2030 is going to be not just overweight, but obese. So the information that you've delivered to my audience thus far has been super, super helpful. Um, is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we wrap up? The stage is yours.
No, not particularly. If people want more information, you can usually find me on Instagram and YouTube, or go to my website, mennohenselmans.com. I have an email course if you want to do kind of a tour of my most popular contents. You'll get that straight to your inbox. And that's it.
Super cool. Well, yeah. Again, I get a ton of value from your Instagram. I love your research breakdowns, and it's hard to find evidence based personas on social. I don't know if you can relate to this or if you've observed this, but it's hard to find evidence based personas on social media that
Mhm.
haven't made their whole shtick just calling out others and like
Yeah.
flexing their credentials. You're one of you actually don't do that. You just share really empowering research. And that's why you're one of the very few people who I actually will send others to in terms of like, yeah, follow this guy. He's going to help you learn about science.
Yeah, I know that reaction videos and everything are super trendy and almost guaranteed to get you views, especially if you go up the ladder in terms of popularity. I personally don't like doing it, and for me, um, like I want to do something that I like doing, and it's far more important to me than money or views or anything. So if I don't like doing it, I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for doing what you do. I've got one last question for you. Before we get to that, maybe share your Instagram, social handles, your website with the audience so people can check you out.
That's Menno.Henselmans for both Instagram and YouTube. If you search me, Google me, Menno, just Google Menno Fitness or whatever, you'll find me.
Very few Mennos. You're probably pretty easy to find.
Yes, it's a good name because it's unique. It's a bad name because nobody knows how to pronounce it, and it looks a bit weird, and everyone thinks I'm German. I'm Dutch, so it's pretty close.
Nice. I like it. Last question that gets asked to everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as a genius, but I mean, I like my life. I think I'm super fortunate. A big part of being successful in anything is getting in at the right time, following your passion. That's super important for me, and I think for everyone, working hard and doing something that you love, and then you can rise to the relative top of your profession.
Love it. Well, best of luck with the remainder of your studies and your incoming PhD. It's super exciting stuff. Welcome back whenever you want to come on. Yeah, thanks for hopping on. I appreciate your time.
Likewise, it was great talking to you.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.